quiet youth on the Midwest plains. Growing up among the rolling fields of Iowa, my youth unfolded in a rhythm both gentle and relentless, a quiet melody woven between the cycle of seasons and the heartbeat of our family dairy farm. My earliest memory is of the canned scent of hay and the low, rumbling moos that floated through the morning mist. Our house, a weathered two-story with peeling white paint, looked out over endless acres of grass that shimmered green beneath the wide Midwest sky. I was the youngest of 3 siblings, a girl often overlooked during the hustle of early mornings and late evenings. My parents worked from sunup to sundown chasing the never-pausing needs of our cattle. Milking at dawn meant stumbling from a warm bed into a kitchen where my mother, elbows deep in biscuit dough, would slide me a quick breakfast. Out back, the sky was always impossibly big, a dome of blue or a tough layer of gray that seemed to press down, both comforting and lonely at once. If people ask about my childhood, I remember the texture of it more than the events. The sting of winter wind on my cheeks, the sticky sweetness of corn syrup on my fingers after chores, and the deep silence that came when it snowed so hard the world seemed muffled and unreachable. School was the next town over. The yellow bus trundled down gravel roads, tire chains rattling over frozen mud. I was shy, one of those girls who sat in the back and scribbled stories in margins, too uncertain to raise her hand when the teacher called for volunteers. Friendships on the prairie were forged in mud, sweat, and after-school games behind the grain silos. There weren't many other kids within walking distance, so I spent more time with the farm animals than with girls my age. The cattle each seemed to have their own personalities. I favored a stubborn old Holstein named Daisy, who would let me brush her sides for hours while I poured out secrets and ambitions I was too timid to speak to anyone else. Money was tight. Our house always rang with laughter, yet there was a weight to each dollar my parents counted at the kitchen table when bills arrived. Birthday presents meant a new pair of boots or a hand-me-down dress, sometimes a slice of store-bought chocolate cake if we'd had a good month selling milk. But there was a richness in our simplicity. On rare nights when we finished work before dark, Dad would light a bonfire in the field's edge and my siblings and I would chase fireflies while Mom played old country songs on a battered radio. Looking back, I see now how those silent, sweeping years shaped me, taught me patience, hard work, and how to find magic in the plainly ordinary. I didn't know it then, but every quiet dawn in Iowa was planting seeds for the strength I would need later in life. First love and a simple wedding. The first time I ever fell in love, it wasn't like the grand gestures or fiery passion often shown in Hollywood movies. It crept in gently, almost shyly, in the most unremarkable of places, a friend's wedding in a country church about 30 miles from our dairy farm in Iowa. I was 24 years old, all nerves and quiet hope, still the shy girl from the back row who preferred to watch life unfold from the sidelines. But that day, something changed. John wasn't the kind of man who commanded a room. He was tall, yes, and strong in a way that farm boys often are, but it was his gentle kindness that caught me off guard. We locked eyes during the reception, as country tunes played on a makeshift dance floor set up by the local community, and I found myself drawn to the warmth in his steady brown gaze. I remember thinking how odd it was that I, who so rarely initiated conversation, felt compelled to smile back as he approached. "Hey there," he said. His voice was soft, edged with a patience that matched the pace of Midwest living. "You mind if I join you?" That was all it took. All the years of shyness folded away under the barnwood rafters. Our first conversation was all clumsy laughter and stories about cows, siblings, and growing up where the wind never stops blowing. The world felt oddly hushed around us, even though children ran wild outside the hall and distant thunder threatened rain. He offered to walk me to the old bus stop after the festivities, holding an umbrella over my head when the storm finally broke. For the first time in years I felt a spark of adventure, like maybe, just maybe, ordinary life could hold a bit of magic. We started dating soon after, though neither of us called it that at the time. With lives tangled up in chores and family duties, most of our time together was spent on porches and farm fields, or taking the long way home along gravel roads. John brought little surprises, wildflowers tied with twine, a thermos of coffee on cold mornings, notes tucked between the pages of books he'd noticed me reading. What I remember most is the comfort. No pressure to perform, no mask to wear. He saw me as I really was, and that acceptance felt like the rarest gift. A year later, we began to talk about the future without even meaning to. The conversation always circled back to the same themes: building a life, sharing laughter, weathering the hard seasons together. John's proposal wasn't dramatic. He asked me one chilly afternoon while fixing a broken fence post. The cows plodded past us, indifferent to the seismic shift occurring in my heart. "Let's build something together, you and me," he said, and I knew he meant it. We planned our wedding with little more than hope and the generosity of neighbors. My mother sewed my dress out of off-white cotton, simple lace added at the sleeves. Our family strung fairy lights in the churchyard, and the preacher's wife baked a layered cake with wild strawberries between. The day was breezy, sunlight slanting gold through the stained glass. I remember walking down the aisle on my father's arm, my knees shaking but my heart utterly certain. John waited at the altar, hands nervously clasped, eyes bright as morning dew. There was no orchestra, just the sound of cicadas and friends humming old hymn tunes. We promised each other what we could: honesty, loyalty, laughter, and patience, knowing full well that life wouldn't always be as gentle as it was that afternoon. When we kissed, the world felt full and new, as if nothing bad could ever intrude upon our joy. The reception bled into evening, fireflies lighting up the fields while we danced under the open sky. Our wedding wasn't lavish, but it was utterly ours, a testament to the power of small things done with great love. That simple ceremony remains, to this day, the most sincere and profound moment I've ever lived. It marked not just the joining of two lives, but the beginning of every hope, trial, and quiet triumph that followed. And in the memory of that first love, timid, yet tenacious, I found the courage to face everything that came next. A sweet year of love together. The year that followed our wedding was as sweet as freshly churned cream, and sometimes I wonder if time has ever moved more gently for anyone else. We had left the rush and chaos of the wedding behind, just two newlyweds tucked away in our little white clapboard house on the edge of endless Iowa fields. Each morning I woke to the low, tender hum of John's voice in the kitchen, humming an old tune his mother must have sung to him. Coffee brewed strong and hot, drifting through the air, while sunlight sliced in thin golden angles across the faded linoleum floor. I would watch him fill his thermos and quietly marvel at how someone could look so at home in the dawn's gentle hush. Our life was simple, with few luxuries but plenty of small joys. We saved every dime that first year, patching up windows with plastic when the wind cut too deep, and fixing fence posts ourselves rather than calling in hired help. Some evenings, after all was fed and the sun had melted into dusk, we'd flop down on the porch swing, shivering beneath a single quilt, just to admire a sky so thick with stars it looked like a spilled sack of sugar. Sometimes I cracked corny jokes just to see John tilt his head back and roar with laughter, the kind of laughter that was rare in his family but always true with me. Date nights were usually nothing more than a drive down into the next town for store-bought root beer and fried catfish at a diner whose vinyl booths squeaked when you slid across. Sometimes John would take my hand and pull me onto the dance floor if the radio was playing something slow, just the two of us, moving in an empty corner of the room, forgotten by everyone except each other. Those dances, the quick kisses at red lights, the way he'd place a hand lightly on the small of my back, these to me were grander than anything in the movies. There were hard days, of course, money was always tight, and Iowa's winters could bite through even the thickest wool. Once the pipes burst in the kitchen and we spent all night bailing water, hands numb and faces drawn tight with exhaustion, but the next morning John made me laugh with a puppet show made from two mismatched socks, and somehow the world felt manageable again. That first anniversary, he surprised me by driving us to a new Italian place that had somehow opened up in the nearest city, 2 hours away. He'd called ahead and arranged for a tiny cake with my name on it, and he handed me a bunch of wildflowers he must have picked from a ditch. I cried, not because of the flowers or the cake, but because it struck me so powerfully that someone could know my heart so well. John blushed as he watched my tears, whispering, "You deserve all the good things, darling." And in that moment, I believed it. Looking back, I see now that every day that year built the sturdy, invisible architecture of our marriage. It taught us patience, forgiveness, and the joy of simply inhabiting the same small space as someone you love. One sweet, slow, stubborn year, utterly ordinary, and infinitely precious. A small, happy wedding at the village church. The happiness that bloomed on our wedding day was nothing short of quiet magic, the kind you only realize in rare moments when everything else slips away. We decided from the start that our wedding wouldn't be showy. Neither John nor I came from wealthy families, and both of us had grown up valuing simplicity, A bouquet of wildflowers over roses flown from overseas, laughter echoing through the church hall instead of a hired band. Our friends and family often called us old souls, and maybe that was why a tiny, white-steepled church in our little Iowa town was the only place we could even imagine saying our vows. The night before, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the humble pews filling with friends I'd known since pigtails and lemonade summers, neighbors who'd watched us grow up, and my mother fussing over my borrowed dress in the glow of a single lamp. While the locusts sang outside my window, my heart thudded with nervous anticipation. I was about to promise forever to a man I'd loved in a quiet, steady way, like the seasons that shaped our lives along the prairie. That morning the world woke gentle and golden. Early sunlight streamed into the farmhouse as my sisters helped me braid my hair, their fingers a little shaky from excitement. My wedding dress was handmade, my mother's simple cotton, spruced up with lace around the sleeves. The only jewelry I wore was a thin gold chain that had belonged to my grandmother. As we drove in my father's pickup to the church, the fields glimmered like an ocean of green all around us, and I had to press my palms against my knees to stop them from trembling. Inside the church, everything felt sharper and more alive. There were fresh flowers tucked into mason jars along the aisle, sunlight painting patterns on the scuffed wooden floor. John stood near the altar, looking every bit the handsome farm boy in his only suit, the gentle strength in his brown eyes outshining the early nerves. His best friend clapped him on the back, and my heart ached with both joy and nerves when I saw the smile they shared. There was no grand orchestra, no professional photographer bustling between guests. Just an upright piano, played by our school music teacher, and voices humming along to the old hymns everyone knew by heart. When I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, his grip steady but his lips pressed tight to hide the pride and emotion, I could see John holding his breath, eyes shining with tears that mirrored my own. I remember nothing about the walk except his face, as though the whole world faded away except for that moment. Our vows were simple, words we'd written together the week before, full of quiet promises, to listen, to stay patient when days were hard, to find joy in morning coffee and troubles shared over the dinner table, to forgive, to choose each other every day. The preacher's voice trembled as he pronounced us husband and wife, and as John slid the modest gold band onto my finger, I felt everything I'd ever dreamed of settle quietly in my chest. The reception was pure Midwest, tables set up in the grass behind the church, checkered tablecloths, and coolers packed with lemonade and iced tea. Neighbors brought casseroles and pies, kids played tag around old oak trees, and a radio somewhere played Johnny Cash. We ate, we laughed, we danced until the sun slid down behind the fields. Friends strung fairy lights from the fence posts, and the whole place glowed soft and golden. Our first dance was awkward and tender, just a slow shuffle on the church lawn, shoes catching in the grass, all nerves and laughter. Someone tossed wildflower petals, and for a second I imagined they were confetti from the universe itself blessing this new chapter. "Promise me you'll always dance with me, even when we're old," John whispered. I answered him by pressing my forehead to his and letting hope bloom inside me, so quiet and strong that I knew this was the kind of happiness you could build a life on. As fireflies twinkled in the dusk, and friends bid us teary goodbyes, we drove back to our tiny rented house, hearts so full we could barely speak. Our wedding wasn't grand, but it was utterly ours, true, deeply felt and stitched together with the kindness and care of everyone who'd shaped us. Even now, if I close my eyes and breathe deeply, I can taste the lemon pie, hear John's vows, and feel the hush of that little church in the middle of endless Iowa fields, the happiest, bravest moment my heart ever knew. Youthful days together in our small home. The early days of our marriage felt like the beginning of a new season, one that promised warmth and quiet joy in every sunrise. Our little wooden house, nestled at the edge of the Iowa plains, became a world of our own. Each morning, light spilled through the thin gingham curtains, and I would wake before John just to watch his chest quietly rise and fall, feeling a hush of gratitude spread over me. We had so little, but it felt like abundance. Plain furniture and a mismatched set of dishes, but there was a cozy rhythm in sharing coffee at the tiny kitchen table, knees sometimes bumping beneath the worn surface. After John left for work on the farm, I tidied up, hung laundry on the line so it fluttered in the prairie wind, and tried new recipes using whatever we had in the garden, always hoping to surprise him when he came home tired and dusted with sunlight. On weekends, our world widened just a little. Sometimes we walked hand in hand along the banks of the Des Moines River, where the sun would dip behind the cottonwoods, staining the water gold as we talked about our dreams. John would make me laugh. He was never much for grand speeches, but his gentle teasing or the way he would brush a stray hair from my face told me everything I needed to know about love. We'd trade stories about our childhoods and hold hands until the dusk pressed us homewards. Evenings were my favorite, the two of us nestled on our old porch swing, a single quilt tucked around our legs. We listened to the whooping of owls and the hum of insects, and sometimes when the sky was clear watched as stars spun slow and bright overhead. That old house echoed with our laughter and sometimes with our worries too, but we were always together, finding comfort in knowing that nothing in the outside world could rattle our foundation. Those sweet months held their share of everyday magic. I learned that the simple acts, baking bread from scratch, patching a rip in John's jeans, leaving a silly note in his lunch, were like love letters scattered through the weeks. John returned the favor with little surprises. A hand-picked daisy, a tin of hard candy slid into my pocket, or once a lopsided wooden box for my sewing threads. We were still so young, still brimming with hope, and the responsibilities of adulthood seemed softened by the glow of new companionship. At night, wrapped up together against the prairie chill, we whispered about a future that, to us, seemed so wide and bright it almost hurt to dream of. Looking back, those first years were golden in a way no prosperity could match, a time when love made even the most ordinary days feel remarkable. The anguish of motherhood and the decision to adopt a child. There's a certain ache that settles in quietly, so persistent and slow you hardly realize when it takes up a home in your heart. It started with hopeful anticipation. Every missed period tugged at my hope, every passing month a fresh cycle of possibility and, inevitably, quiet disappointment. While our home brimmed with love and laughter echoed in the spaces between our morning routines and late-night confessions, there existed a silence. It was the unspoken, the longing for a child, a spirit to fill the empty, sunlit room we'd painted pale yellow during that first flush of marriage. At first, John and I filled the ache with busyness, tending the cows, mending fences, sharing suppers under starry skies. I buried my fears, letting life's endless to-do list buffer me from yearning too hard. But the ache grew, steady as a prairie wind. Every neighbor's new baby, every cooing toddler toddling past our pew at church, each pregnancy announcement tucked inside a neighbor's casserole delivery. They pressed gently and sometimes cruelly against my guarded joy. I wondered if I was broken, if there was something in me incapable of giving John the family he deserved. At night I'd lie awake, counting the hours in the hush between John's even breaths, listening to the creaks of our old farmhouse and to the ache inside me. We tried everything available to us, trips to the nearest city for doctor visits, herbal teas recommended by neighbors, awkward conversations about hope and science with the kindly local nurse. There were moments of optimism, times I thought I felt the flutter of new life within me, but each time the hope faded. John, steadfast as ever, held me in the disappointment, never blaming, always gentler than I thought I deserved. "We have love," he'd remind me, brushing my hair back from tear-stained cheeks. "Maybe it just needs a different path." Slowly, what began as a silent ache grew into conversations whispered late into the night. We talked about adoption cautiously at first, unsure if our hearts were ready or if we were enough. But one frosty winter evening, sitting side by side with mugs of cocoa, John reached for my hand. The resolve in his gentle eyes steadied me. "Family is made by love," he said quietly. "If there's a child out there who needs us, I think we're meant to find each other." It wasn't an easy decision, not in a community where blood ties ran as deep as the old well out back. Questions from neighbors, uncertainty from extended relatives, and my own trembling uncertainty sometimes threatened to drown my hope. Yet, the more we spoke of it, the clearer it became. Love was the only thing necessary to transform our house into a true home. We started the process with a mixture of nervous excitement and quiet dread. Bureaucracy came armed with endless paperwork, interviews that felt abrupt and intrusive, and a waiting period that tested even the patience learned from a lifetime of farm living. Still, I sewed a little blue quilt in the evenings, my hands needing to believe before my heart dared to. The day we met, Tommy, remains vivid in my memory, a gray April afternoon fragrant with the promise of spring. The orphanage was a squat brick building, its windows lined with paper tulips and peeling paint. Inside, children's laughter mingled with the persistent thrum of longing in the air. And then I saw him, a small boy with wide, hopeful eyes clutching a battered toy train close to his chest. Time seemed to pause as he looked up, as if even the universe waited to see if some connection would spark between us. I knelt, unsure my words would reach him, but when I smiled he smiled back, shy and bright like the first crocus after snowmelt. The director introduced us, her voice gentle as she explained his story. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Fear and longing dissolved beneath the force of something both fierce and immediate, a sense of belonging, unmistakable, and overwhelming. When the paperwork was finally signed and Tommy's hand slipped into mine for the first time, the emptiness that had haunted our home was replaced by an exhilarating new energy, nervous giggles, clumsy footsteps on creaky boards, and 100 questions tumbling from curious lips. John beamed, his big arms awkward as he scooped Tommy up, sometimes both of them laughing as if they'd been waiting lifetimes to find each other. The journey to motherhood, as winding and unexpected as wandering a path through summer cornfields at dusk, had led me not where I'd planned, but where I was needed most. Every night since, tucking Tommy in beneath the soft blue quilt, I whisper a quiet thank you into the dark, for the ache, the waiting, and the miracle of a family grown not from my body, but from the stubborn, endless root of love. Maternal love grows on the dairy farm. The months after bringing Tommy home felt like the quiet blossoming of summer after a long, cold spring, a transformation so gentle that it was only in looking back I could see how much our lives had changed. There was a new energy in our modest dairy farm. The kitchen echoed with new laughter, the scratch of tiny boots on worn floorboards, the delighted squeals as Tommy discovered each kitten in the hayloft or chased after barn swallows, darting through the early morning light. Being a mother at first was tinged with a trembling hope. Would this fragile, beautiful bond endure, and would I be enough? But love, as I soon learned, grows best in the rituals of everyday life. Each morning Tommy would scamper into the yard while I did chores, sometimes mimicking my movements as I tugged at buckets or gathered eggs, his little hands clumsy but determined. John was patient, showing him how to coax shy calves from their stalls or cradle a chick in his palm with gentle pride. It stunned me sometimes how quickly the old routines gained new warmth with a child's presence. Meals became a symphony of small discoveries, Tommy's fascination with mashed potatoes shaped into hills, or the way he delighted in plucking green beans from the garden, squealing whenever he uncovered a hidden tomato. Bath times followed long afternoons spent tumbling in the grass, his face stained with the evidence of the day, chocolate milk, strawberry jam, and whatever mischief he'd gotten into with the hound dog. At night, John would read aloud by oil lamp, while I stitched by the window and Tommy nestled, thumb in mouth, his trust in us as sure as the steady beat of the farm's heart. Yet motherhood was also a story of patience, 1,000 small anxieties packed tightly in my chest. The fear that I'd fall short, the ache when Tommy struggled with a new word or shrank back around strangers, reminded me how deep the roots of belonging must grow. But for every hardship there were victories. The first unprompted mama that escaped his lips, the fierce bear hugs that nearly toppled me, and the simple joy that spilled from his laughter as we chased fireflies long past bedtime. Unexpected disasters and major family challenges. The suddenness of tragedy is like a thunderstorm on an otherwise cloudless afternoon. There is never warning enough, and the sky darkens in a heartbeat. For us, it began with the ordinary hum of a summer day. The cows were grazing lazily along the far meadow, and John was out by the barn repairing a sagging gate that had bothered him for weeks. I remember looking up from the kitchen window, admiring the way the sunlight glanced off his shoulders, never imagining how drastically everything was about to change. It was Tommy, playing with the barn cat, who screamed first. The sound cut through the air, shrill and immediate, and every muscle in my body tensed. As I ran out in my muddy boots, my heart threatened to beat out of my chest. There was John, crumpled beside the feed sacks, his face as white as linen and his body terrifyingly still. I dropped to my knees in the dust, clutching his hand, calling his name into the thick, unmoving air. Tommy sobbed behind me, his little fingers twisting the hem of my skirt. The ride to the hospital was a blur, the screech of tires on gravel, the frantic voice on the phone to the paramedics, the interminable wait in a cold emergency room lit harshly by fluorescent bulbs. I replayed every moment in our marriage, every laugh and small quarrel, the ink on our adoption papers, the first time I'd seen John hold Tommy. I whispered silent bargains into the silence, asking for just one more ordinary day. John had suffered a serious stroke, words that seemed to echo endlessly in the sterile corridors. The doctor spoke gently, outlining the damage done. The right side of his body had gone limp, and his speech dissolved into a jumble of sounds that barely resembled his gentle drawl. He looked at me with panic and frustration, trapped in a body that refused his will. I held his hand, promising love could weather this, even as my own fear gnawed at the edges of hope. Hospital days became a haze, the rhythm of monitors, the shifting scent of antiseptic, the drip of rain against window glass. Tommy drew pictures for his father with crayons on napkins, his childish prints spelling hard-won, "I love yous." I tried to be strong, my voice steady on the surface, my heart breaking beneath. I learned to wash John's hair, to help him with meals, to read the flickers of meaning in his eyes when words failed him. After weeks that stretched endlessly, John finally opened his eyes one morning, clearer and more himself. I wept quietly at his bedside, tears partly of relief, partly of exhaustion that angled deep into my bones. The doctors explained it would be a long road, physical therapy, speech exercises, a home forever changed by new limitations. And so we brought him back to our farmhouse, carrying more uncertainty than luggage. Each day was a test of patience and stubborn hope. Tommy became an unexpected helper. Cautiously he learned to read to his father, to carry tools, to fetch water without being asked. I became nurse, farmhand and mother all at once. There were moments I hid in the pantry and wept, then dried my face on a flour sack and forced my smile back into place for my boys. The farm, once a symbol of endless possibility, now felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. I patched together chores between urgent care, balancing bills, doctor visits, and tending crops with hands that ached and eyes that blurred from sleeplessness. Despite everything, there were small glimmers, the first time John managed to feed himself again, a lopsided grin breaking through the fatigue. Tommy's birthday, when John struggled to sing along with us, a chorus wobbly but true. The neighbors brought casseroles and warm bread, dropping by just to offer comfort and let us rest for an hour. Their kindness reminded me that hardship draws a community closer, that in the darkest moments we are all just trying to reach for each other. Some nights I lay awake listening to John's breathing, letting the farm's familiar creaks and sighs remind me that even when everything else changes, love is as persistent as the dawn. We lost a sense of our old life that summer, but I learned the courage it takes to meet disaster with open arms, to choose hope when each step feels heavier than the last. Even now I can still see that day, the sunlight, the scream, the rush to the hospital as the beginning of our greatest challenge and in time, the birth of a new resilience I never thought possible. Rowing alone and silent sacrifices. In the aftermath of John's stroke, it felt as though the world I had built, so carefully and with such hope, was suddenly spinning off its axis. He returned home a changed man, his gaze softened by vulnerability, his body frail where once it had been strong. It fell to me to steady our lives, to become the unshakable center that our family so desperately needed. Each morning began in darkness, sometimes before the birds stirred, with the lighting of lamps and the measured giving of John's medication. I would help him sit up, stifling the pain in my own back as I gently supported him, careful not to let my exhaustion show. Running the dairy farm became a solitary undertaking. Where once John had mended fences and led the milking, now I shouldered the chores myself, hauling pails, feeding calves before the sun crested the horizon, and wrestling stubborn cows back behind wire. My palms blistered beneath work gloves that never seemed to dry. My knees ached at night from hours spent bending, lifting, and tending to every urgent need. But there was little time to dwell on discomfort or fatigue. Between bursts of work, I checked in on Tommy as he hurried through his schoolwork, making sure his spirits remained buoyed despite the storm that had hit our family. The weight of responsibility pressed down in quiet ways, a stack of bills on the kitchen table growing each week, repairs that piled up, and the gnawing worry about whether I could hold everything together. Evenings were the hardest, when the farm finally quieted and fatigue settled into my bones. I would sit with John, spooning soup into his mouth, cleaning his hands, listening to the fractured bits of speech slowly returning to him, and masking my own tears as hopeful encouragement. Sometimes I offered stories from our early days, hoping to coax a smile or a flicker of the man I'd married from behind the fog of his sickness. Most nights I collapsed into bed long after midnight, my arms leaden and my mind spinning with to-do lists for the next day. The loneliness at times was palpable, a hush broken only by the distant howl of coyotes or the snore of our old hound dog. On the worst days, my doubts crept in. Was I enough for this family? Could I give Tommy the childhood he deserved, support John's recovery, and preserve our way of life? And yet somewhere between the endless chores and the small victories, John managing to lift his cup, Tommy winning a spelling bee at school, the cows calving healthy in the spring, I found a new kind of strength. It was forged in silence and sacrifice, in the hundreds of invisible moments when I chose, again and again, to fight for our future. These sacrifices shaped me, teaching resilience, patience, and an unwavering love that grew sharper and truer under hardship. I rarely let my struggles show to Tommy. I wanted him to grow up believing in hope and perseverance, not weighted down by the sense of loss. Quietly, I became everything he needed: mother, teacher, friend, and at times the only steady adult presence anchoring his world. When he faced trouble at school, or retreated into himself, I made time to sit and listen, fixing broken toy cars or working beside him on farm chores so life felt as normal as possible. We celebrated small successes with homemade treats and whispered promises for brighter days ahead. Privately, there were nights I paced the kitchen, my nerves fraying with every uncertainty, a cost I never counted when I first imagined family life. There were breakdowns behind closed doors, silent prayers offered against the window glass, and hours spent seeking advice or comfort from neighbors who understood but could not carry my burdens for me. Sometimes I nursed quiet resentment, at fate, at the unfairness of illness, at the relentless demands that refused to let up. Then the dawn would break, life would demand my attention, and I pressed on, compelled by a love deeper than exhaustion or fear. What kept me going through those silent battles was the knowledge that every sacrifice, every tear, every ache, every lonely meal eaten while standing at the sink, was an act of love. With each passing season, I came to realize that the truest heroism often blooms in the uncelebrated places, in lives quietly held together not by grand gestures, but by the steady courage to keep moving forward, day after day. Over time, Tommy and John did begin to heal, if not entirely back to the life we once knew, then at least into a tender new normal. The farm survived, ragged but still ours. My hands, once delicate, grew strong and capable, evidence of my resolve etched into every scar and callus. I learned to trust in my own resourcefulness, creating joy from scraps and tradition from necessity. The love I poured into our home, though quiet and unseen by most, was the foundation that kept us upright through storms both literal and figurative. Looking back, those years were marked by hardship, but they were also illuminated by the hope that flickered even in the darkest hours. My sacrifices remained mostly invisible, whispered between rows of corn and in the soft closing of bedroom doors at night. Yet in those sacrifices, I discovered the ever-deepening strength of the human heart and the power of love to carry us, quietly and steadily, through whatever comes next. Emotional storms and the event of losing a husband. The days after John's stroke brought with them a tide of invisible burdens. I watched as the strong, gentle partner I had known seemed to shrink inside his own suffering, weighed down by frustration and disappointment no words could untangle. His speech slowly returned, but not the easy laughter. Days grew heavy with silence, broken only by the rattle of medicine bottles or the distant mooing of cows from the pasture. It was in those muted stretches between sunrise and dusk that the real heartache blossomed. Sometimes I would catch John outside after chores, standing stock still beneath the old oak tree, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Other times, the evenings would bring a deep, wordless sorrow, a longing for all the simple joys that had once come so easily. In those moments, he would turn away, unwilling or unable to explain the weight he carried. I learned to work around his moods, comforting Tommy through the confusion, hiding my own worries behind gentle reassurances. I clung to small routines, a cup of weak coffee before dawn, the soft lamplight casting golden shapes across our weathered kitchen table, the shared silence as night crept in around our little house. Sometimes, when the loneliness in John's eyes darkened, he sought solace in whiskey. It started slow, an extra glass at dinner, a splash in his morning coffee, the edge of longing dulled by the burn of liquor. The farm chores that once steadied him now fell to the wayside, and I was left to patch up the growing gaps in our lives, clinging to hope that the man I'd loved would return to me whole. I never raised my voice. Instead, I wrapped my words in patience and did my best to draw him closer, listening to the hurt behind each silence, searching for ways to remind him that, even amidst bitterness, love remained. But fate seldom gives easy answers. One frosty morning, as the first thaw of spring softened the edges of winter, John suffered another stroke. This time, there were no long recoveries, no slow crawls back to himself. The world compressed to a few frantic phone calls, the blurred wash of ambulance lights, and a single unbearable moment in a white-walled hospital room when the doctor shook his head and gently led me away. Returning home alone with Tommy huddled by my side, I felt every inch of emptiness fill the spaces between the ticking clock and the steady hush of the fields. At John's funeral, neighbors gathered beneath the wide sky, offering casseroles and quiet condolences. Tommy, too young for words, wept into my coat as I pressed my hand to the cold bark of the old oak tree, the place John had loved best, and promised him, wherever he was, that we would find a way forward. The sorrow seemed to seep into the walls of our house, but so did a stubborn, flickering belief that love, however battered, could outlast any storm. The ache of loss would not undo us. I owed it to Tommy, to John's memory, and to the life we'd built, to keep picking up the pieces and walking on. A rooster raising chicks, raising new hope. The season after John's passing transformed me from a wife into a single mother, one whose only compass was the love I still carried and the daunting responsibility of raising Tommy on my own. The house reverberated with an emptiness I couldn't fill, yet my days were too full for self-pity. There were cows to be milked at dawn, bills to face, and a young boy who looked to me for stability, and more than ever, for hope. In those earliest mornings, I often found myself standing in the kitchen's hush, staring at John's old mug, and wondering how I would do this alone. Yet, each time Tommy called out for me, or the farm demanded my attention, I rediscovered a stubborn determination. Somehow, the same grit that let my ancestors till this stubborn land now pulsed in my veins. I put on my boots and kept going. Tommy, sensitive and bright, was grieving too. His nightmares would wake him crying for his father. I learned to cradle his head in my lap, to whisper stories of John, his gentle humor, the lessons he'd taught, the way he'd always said, "We get through it no matter what." I tried to model that resilience. Bit by bit, as seasons changed, we wove new routines, shared breakfasts by candlelight in winter, and watching meteors streak the sky on hot July nights, making wishes neither of us would speak aloud. Money was always short, but I never let Tommy feel the worry. I picked up extra work mending neighbors' clothes, selling homemade pies at the county fair, and sometimes taking odd jobs in the nearest town. The community quietly rallied behind us. Mrs. Chambers from the next farm over would arrive with a hot casserole when our spirits and pantry both ran low. The school principal gave Tommy library privileges after hours. Small acts of kindness helped patch the holes John's absence had left. Through all this, I kept my eyes on Tommy's dreams. He was endlessly curious, always with his nose in a book, always peppering me with questions about how the world worked, about faraway cities and how people built bridges and healed the sick. When he shyly confessed he wanted to be a doctor, I encouraged him with every ounce of faith I possessed. It meant scrimping and saving, missing out on new shoes or a proper vacation. But sending Tommy to science camp in the summer or buying a used set of encyclopedias felt like laying down stepping stones for his future, one determined sacrifice at a time. I learned to celebrate small triumphs, the way Tommy would stride up the front walk, report card in fist, his eyes shining with pride, and maybe a glimmer meant for the father who was gone. Or the nights he'd curl up on the porch beside me, listening to crickets, and say suddenly that he felt lucky after all. My heart would ache with gratitude, a quiet realization that while we'd lost much, we hadn't lost everything. Together, we had forged a new kind of family, braced by hope and defined by love. As Tommy grew into a teenager, the bond between us only deepened. There were times when he pulled away, wrestling with sorrow or the weight of responsibility that comes with being a child who has seen loss too soon. I tried not to push but to steady him with my presence, a hand on his shoulder, a mug of cocoa on exam nights, a promise that no failure would ever undo my pride or affection for him. We quarreled, of course, sometimes about money, sometimes about curfews, sometimes about nothing at all. But forgiveness always found its way back between us by breakfast. The hardest part of being both mother and father was living with the doubt that crept in at night. Was I giving Tommy enough? Was I doing right by John's memory? But every day that Tommy stood a little taller, laughed a little louder, or shared his secrets with me, I realized we were, in our own makeshift way, doing something extraordinary. When the acceptance letter from the University of Iowa finally arrived, Tommy wept in my arms as if the ache of every past pain was dissolving into hope. I knew then that the journey, though hard and marked by so many invisible sacrifices, had been worth every moment. Adversity in the twilight years and light amid the dark night. With Tommy grown and thriving in his medical studies, I found myself stepping into a new season of life, one for which I hadn't prepared. The house, once echoing with laughter, chores, and camaraderie, now often stood in a patient hush. It was a strange kind of stillness, one that weighed on my spirit as days folded into weeks. At first I clung to old farm routines, rising before dawn, feeding the remaining cows by hand, tending the small vegetable patch out back, even though my bones complained more with each year. But time is relentless, and the rhythm of life on the dairy farm, once my comfort, now underscored how different everything had become. Tommy, ever the dutiful son, visited as often as his studies and future allowed. He always brought back city stories and bright smiles. But one evening, after sharing soup at the kitchen table, he cleared his throat and gently suggested it might be time for me to consider slowing down. "You've carried so much for so long, Mom," he said. "You don't have to do this alone." The thought of leaving my home, even for comfort, even for safety, terrified me more than I cared to admit. Still, when winter crept in again, bringing aches to every joint, and a loneliness I couldn't wave away, I agreed to visit a local care home at Tommy's urging. The transition was not graceful. Stripped from the familiar sprawl of fields and the steady rhythm of work, I found myself adrift in a place where routines were dictated by the ringing of distant bells, not the changing of the sky. I missed the comfort of wood smoke, the company of animals, and the knowledge that whatever weariness I felt was earned under open air. Days blurred together in the quiet halls, punctuated by chatter with staff, scheduled meals, and visits from Tommy that always seemed too short. There were moments of despair that threatened to settle in for good. I questioned my worth in this new chapter. Was my usefulness only measured by the chores I could do, the people I could serve, or the family I could nurture? Loneliness became a silent companion, whispering doubts to fill the empty evening hours. I grieved not just for John and my youth but for the sense of purpose that had quietly dissolved when the farm days ended. Everything changed the morning I met David, the young man who had recently purchased our old dairy farm. He arrived one brisk day to visit the care home, looking for advice about the herd that had been stubborn since the change in ownership. He was awkward but earnest, his hands rough and familiar in the way of country folk. When he asked if I'd mind sharing some of my experience, maybe even stopping by the farm now and again, my heart skipped at the prospect. The first drive back down those gravel roads was bittersweet. Bittersweet because so much was different now, yet the land itself welcomed me as if no time had passed. David was there, notebook in hand, eager but humble, and I realized that imparting the hard-won lessons of a lifetime was yet another way to serve, to care, to matter. I visited more frequently, helping with calves, troubleshooting milking machinery, and offering my shoulder when the crops failed or the weather threatened disaster. In teaching David, and sometimes just sitting quietly watching the sunset over acres of grass swaying gold, I found the old ache of loneliness softening. The cows remembered my voice. The rhythm of chores came back naturally, as did the laughter that spilled between moments of honest work. The friendship with David grew into something like family, a connection forged by the shared stubborn hope that ties all farmers together. The care home became less of a finish line and more of a resting stop on the journey. I realized that purpose doesn't vanish, it just changes shape. Sometimes light seeps into your world quietly. Through a conversation with an eager learner, the grateful nudge of an animal you once raised, or a letter from your grown child saying thank you for every night you stayed up, worrying and hoping for their future. By the time spring returned, I could sense the wisdom in the words I had so often recited to comfort others. Every relentless dusk carries the seed of a new dawn. My story, full of struggle, quiet victories, and the ache of letting go, was far from over. David's visits, Tommy's phone calls, the rhythms of farm life echoed in my heart. These were not remnants of a past life, but guiding lights for the days ahead. Standing at the fence one late afternoon, the prairie wind tugging at my hair, I felt something like forgiveness blooming inside me. Forgiveness for all I couldn't change, gratitude for every hard-earned joy, and hope, a slender but persistent thread, that life, even at its dusk, is rich with the promise of renewal. For anyone who finds themselves lost in the shadows of age or sorrow, I would gently say, let the light in, however it comes. Sometimes it finds you just when you need it most.